Assalamu alaikum, viewers. Today, this is the third program in my series, Voices from America. And we have the honor and the privilege to have Dr. Kenney Steinman with us. Dr. Kenney Steinman did his PhD in public health from University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, the US. He's been interested in family violence and public policy. And he grew up in Boston, Brookline, I think.
Very good, yes. Good memory.
And but then he's been living in Ohio for the longest time now. So Dr. Steinman, I'd like to start by asking you about your early experiences, especially your childhood, and anything else that you feel relevant as something that went into making you who you are, your formative experiences.
Absolutely, that's a great question from a psychologist. So, my first reaction to your question, my first response, that is my parents. I was fortunate to grow up in a home where both my parents were still married, because divorce when I was growing up was very common. And many of my best friends, their families were divorced. The father walked out. I very much remember growing up having kids in my house, my friends crying to my parents, talking about their experience. And so, which is, especially for boys, a little weird to have your friend crying in front of your parents. And that happened on more than one occasion. And so I really admired my parents, for sticking together, but also for reaching out and taking in other kids who were, and doing so in a kind way, not a non-patronizing way. So I guess I grew up feeling very lucky. I grew up and also I think social class is important. My father is still a doctor. He's the oldest practicing kidney doctor in Boston. He's still 82 years old and going strong. He worked very hard, and he grew up working class, but had worked his way up, and I admired that. And we grew up relatively comfortably in an urban suburb. My mother was a social worker, and we, had a loving family. I have two brothers, and we, were doing well. But that said, unlike many kids at that time, I wouldn't call it a bubble. Many of my friends, as I mentioned, not only came from broken homes, but some were on food stamps. There were public housing projects a couple blocks from my house. And so I, went to a high school where there were 70 different languages spoken, a public high school. And so, yes, I grew up sort of in an upper middle class professional home and was lucky about that, but felt very fortunate. So I think that's really informed my own sense of self and where I stand within a family. When I became a father, when I became a husband, what I thought, that should be like, those are my role models, but also just in terms of how I think of myself in society. What do I, who am I? What do I owe? And trying to, both for myself and for our children, try to live a life that is not so much insulated from the the rest of society. So I could go on in many ways, but I'll let you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Now, can you tell me something about your grandparents as well? Because I know that's something you sort of feel very strongly about in terms of who you are right now and what you're doing.
Right. And there's many things that interest me, but one thing that's always interested me is the immigrant experience, specifically in America, but also in other contexts as well. And some of that comes out of my own personal experience. The one thing I think about my grandparents or great-grandparents, for those I knew, is that they were short. All these short people. And I'm pretty tall. My brothers are even taller. My parents are not quite as tall, but but they were all short. And because they had grown up, poor, in not a great diet. And I think this is a phenomenon that happens a lot, both when people move to a wealthier society, but also even as a society becomes wealthier, people tend to get taller. And so, and some of them spoke with accents, and it felt different. I mean, it wasn't that unusual per se, but it did make me feel a little bit apart from the rest of American society. I am Jewish, and I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood in Boston, and many of the families had similar experience. Their grandparents had come over. In some cases, the parents had come over after World War II and the Holocaust, and so there was a sense that, wow, we are, just like I said, I felt lucky to be in a family that was together. And this was also a sense of, wow, we're lucky to, as a community, to be here and to be doing pretty well. And so that sense of perspective and gratitude, I think, was a big part of my understanding growing up.
There is something else I would like you to shed light on, if you feel comfortable about it. There is a lot of anti-Semitic propaganda in countries like Pakistan, and I feel that people need to have a personal understanding of it. They've heard facts from one side and facts from another side, but I don't think they've ever, well, many of them have ever met anybody whose parents or grandparents have a history of persecution.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I think there are pluses and minuses too. I really don't know much about how Jews are perceived in South Asia. I could imagine, but I'm really not sure. It'll be unfair for me to speculate. But I can say, sort of from my own experience, that yeah, where you know, it's just I grew up Jewish. Everyone in my family is Jewish. Most of my friends are Jewish. And one of the things I found helpful, and it's not unique to the Jewish community in America, that is, like Pakistan, so big, and there's hundreds of millions of people. And but perhaps unlike Pakistan, there's not the same sense of like ethnic or religious solidarity, and so it's easy to feel lost in a modern condition where you're not really sure. Yes, you're friendly with your neighbors, or you have your friends who have similar education or similar interests, but it's not a community. And so one of the things I've come to value is that having not just a Jewish community, but even an immigrant, community of this group or of that group, I think is really helpful in these large, diverse societies. We still, the word might not be the best word, but this idea of being sort of tribal, I think there's something that people need to have a feeling of, oh, I belong to this group. And even if I'm not friends with all of them, and even if they drive me crazy, it's still my family, it's still where I belong. And I think people in the modern condition, in the global world we live in now, I think still that helps. One thing that I think people may not appreciate about being Jewish is, listen, I'm professional, I have a PhD. My father and my mother both have graduate degrees. We're relatively well off. But that also there is a sense of fear that we often feel like we don't quite belong, and that or we're not quite sure. I mean, my wife's father and her grandmother, fled to this country after World War II. They were survivors. He grew up in Slovakia, and the rest of the family essentially was killed. And so we, the other ones we have many experiences of what are called pogroms, violent riots, where there was rape and murder, and people fled because they were scared. And so I think many people may not appreciate how many Jews feel this ongoing intergenerational sense of trauma that is still very real. And yes, can be misused like anyone, but I think there's things I'm very proud of being Jewish, but I think this is a fundamentally human thing that many other peoples who have experienced something traumatic and they had to move are wrestling with similar issues. And so I think of, in my own community, the Bhutanese Nepali community, who were refugees from Bhutan, ethnic Nepalis who had fled Bhutan to come to Nepal. They might have been in Nepal for 10, even 20 years. and then they've been able to immigrate to the U.S. And they happen to, long story short, come to Columbus. They have the Somali community. There's a very large Somali community. They, of course, had a devastating civil war in the early 90s, and they started coming, and they've, tried to reestablish themselves here. So I feel a sense of kinship with their experience. Not that I know what they've gone through, but I think when people ask, why are you bothering with these other people who live in a different neighborhood, who don't look like you, who don't, different education level? And I said, well, these were my grandparents. I mean, this is what they were like, and they spoke with accents. And yes, these people speak with accents, but it's my way of sort of thanking America and it's now my turn to welcome them, just as some other people welcomed my family.
Well, it does sound very intense. What do you make of what's happening in the US right now? People here get a sort of very different version depending on which media source they're watching.
Sure.
So I remember I remember Kenney from Dartmouth College, and I remember how we were involved in this Muslim-Jewish students dialogue,
I remember, yeah,
where we were trying to build common ground and come together as people belonging to different faiths, but people of faith nonetheless.
Yeah.
So what do you make of what's happening in the US right now?
Oh, I have so many feelings. Well, there's many things happening in the U.S. right now, and if it's bewildering. And it's, on the one hand, I am very scared about, this is my own, I can only speak about my own personal experience and my own perspective. I am very scared about what President Trump is doing to our country. I don't think it's just him. I think he has tapped into a certain cultural drive that is resonating with a lot of people, not even most Americans, but enough Americans who are living in certain places that the way our political system works really enables him to get a fair bit of political power. So on one hand, I'm very scared about eroding many of the institutions that have made America a special, hopeful place. Not perfect by any means, but that some of the things that I've always been impressed with about America, I worry he's undermining that in ways that many people don't care about. They don't really shrug their shoulders. Oh well, he's vilifying the media. Oh well, he's ignoring what the difference between the military and the government. Oh well, he's pitting one faction of society against another. These are things that no president in my lifetime has done to the same extent. And there's plenty of presidents who I disagree with on policy, including Trump, but that even someone who I might disagree with on policy, I always felt like even if I thought they were misguided, I always felt they were trying to do the right thing. So on one hand, I'm very afraid of what's going on in a way I've never felt afraid before. I've had friends, this gets back to the immigrant experience, often Jewish friends whose parents had to flee Europe after the Holocaust, and the way that the German government law works, if they happen to come from Germany, they can actually apply for German citizen if they're the child of a German citizen who had to flee. And some have actually started to look into that with the idea that they might need to leave. I mean, it's really, I never, in my wildest dreams, imagined anyone would ever consider that. On the other hand, so that's where what's also the more recent protests around George Floyd and Black Lives Matter gives me hope. I feel like some people speak of slavery as our country's original sin, and that something we've never really wrestled with. And so the fact that we're wrestling with it in a way that is making people uncomfortable and aware in a way I've never seen in my entire life gives me hope. And so it's uncomfortable, but protest should be uncomfortable. It should make us, have to revisit some of these aspects of our society. I think one of the great things and also one of the problems about America at the same time is our lack of history. I mentioned before about how it's so big and so diverse, and many people come here and you're supposed to sort of forget your history. So you might have a Serb and a Croat who have shops next to each other, and they might have hated each other. They might have even shot each other in the old country. But here it's okay. They might not be friends, but they'll get along. And guess what? Their kids go to the same school and they become friends. Or it could be, an Indian and a Pakistani, shopkeepers next to each other, and they're living, and they might, have plenty to argue about, but they'll get along, and their kids will go to the same school, and so it's wonderful that we can kind of move past that. The downside, though, is that we don't really, within American society, think seriously and carefully about our history and how there are peoples who have been repeatedly oppressed, and how the whole system is set up to control and limit many people. African Americans being, probably the greatest example. So I think as a country, we cannot become what we could be if we don't directly wrestle with Black Lives Matter. And so I'm happy to have been part of, involved in that a bit. And I'm even more proud that both of our boys, on their own, without any pressure from us, have also become involved in those protests.
Dr. Steinman, where do you see this going? I mean, I look at protests, and I remember having been involved in protests myself during the 80s when I was a student. On the one hand, there is the sense that these protests are spontaneous, and then we see some very well organized and well orchestrated protests as well. Where do you think it's all headed? And is there any coherent strategy behind this? Do people want to achieve any short, medium, or long-term goals from it? What's your sense?
That's a great question. I don't think one of the things that I think is a strength and again a weakness of the current protests is that they're very organic. They're very grassroots. There are no leaders. Yes, there are some politicians who are trying to sort of position themselves to sort of assume the role of leader, but in general, they're very organic, and and that's wonderful because there's a sense of genuineness and passion that is hard to fake, and so people, I think, are coming out in ways that they wouldn't otherwise come out. The downside, as you point out, is that it's hard to sustain this. We have to translate protest into policy at some point. And who gets to decide what the exact policy should be? You have a crowd, many of whom don't have a clear policy sense. They're just outraged. They just want this to stop. They want us to recognize what's going on. And we can and should be looking at our history. And maybe that's something we could all agree is something we should invest more in. My wife is a historian, so she would, I'm sure she would like to hear me say that. But I don't know where this is going. I think also the other part of the success and the popularity of these protests are that people are just angry at Trump and at the country in general. And even though these aren't directly addressed at Trump necessarily, I think that this is the first kind of effort to get everyone that's really captivated a broad section of people. And with the COVID-19 pandemic and many people being out of work and many kids being unable to, let's say, go to summer camp or go to this experience being out of school, there's lots of people with free time on their hands. And so I think that's made it easier to organize these kinds of efforts. But again, to sustain it and to where it will go, I don't know. I can speculate, but I don't know anything. You can speculate too. So,
okay. As a man of faith, there is a lot of discussion here in Pakistan also about COVID-19, and on top of that, we've had a locust attack.
Yes, I heard about that.
Yeah, we have this sort of massive invasion by the locusts from Africa, and our agriculture, our crops are threatened. A lot of people are talking about divine retribution. What is your sense of it? Do you see some of it, like in this COVID-19 and other things?
in short, no. Far be it from me to kind of know God's mind and God's plan. I mean, I think that I do find faith and comfort, I suppose, in feeling like there is a plan to the world and someone ultimately or something ultimately is in charge. But that for me to try to say, oh, this, you know, as you, I'm sure, can name many examples, when people try to say, oh, this locust attack or this plague is because of this. I've heard ministers of certain governments say that, oh, the plague in our country is because of homosexuality, and that's why it's happening. And then guess what? A few days later, he contracted the virus. So it becomes you have to be careful how you're framing things, and that so I see so many people trying to make these connections, and I think we should temper ourselves with some humility to say, you know, we if we are to, you know, try to imitate God in some way, however we imagine that, being kind to others and to the oppressed is what our job is, and don't worry about the mysteries of exactly why. Just use that as a motivation to try to do good in the world. And yes, we should think and we should absolutely talk about it and question, but be very careful about. I guess the questions are more interesting than the answers. You know, I think it's good to ask, why is this happening, and to really wrestle with that question. But God forbid we should get to a point where we say, I know why this is happening. So I think let's stick with the questions and try to avoid the answers.
Brilliant. Okay, there is one other issue that, you know, although it's not directly related to what we were talking about, but it's of interest, I think, a mutual interest. You're a faculty member at your university. I am teaching in a university in Pakistan. There is this a crisis in higher education where a lot of the people are not ready for online teaching, or many do not really understand the digital media. I believe that even though we've been accessing it, so a lot of people would use YouTube videos, or you would use you know, things on Instagram or Facebook, but when it comes to communicating with students using the same medium, I would say a very large number is very, very uncomfortable. Is there something that you guys are doing there that we can learn from, or some experiences that you'd like to share about that?
Sure. I wish my wife was here because she could. She's you know, she's a professor in history and is teaching and has a lot more, and this is much more relevant for her. I actually don't teach classes. I'm a researcher, so, but I spend a lot of time on Zoom with meetings these days. Just two quick points. One is that you're absolutely right. As you may know, teaching online is very different than teaching in person. It's there's things you can do, there's things you can't do, and there's no real training. Most of the faculty just don't know. And so all of a sudden last semester, in the middle of the semester, you had this switch to this. And some of the professors who really cared about teaching did amazing things to try to make it happen. Sometimes it works, sometimes not. But also a lot of professors who have many other pressures to publish or to do service in certain ways, they say, okay, well, I'm going to kind of, you know, just try a little bit, but not really worry too much. And so I think, so then the universities themselves were scrambling to try to figure out what to do. The other side of it, and I have no idea, I'd be curious to hear your perspective on what it's like in Pakistan, but that the images, the ideals of American higher education is that even though we come from a diverse country, when we get to the university, everyone's the same. We should all be treated the same. Yes, there's some people who are wealthy or some people who are poor, so some people need to work this job versus that job, but that in general, in principle, everyone's equal. When we went to online learning, all of a sudden it sort of removed that facade, because then you are looking at teaching students, and they might have a computer, but some of them don't, or some of them come from a home where they don't have internet access. and they have to go to a car and sit outside the library in their car and take classes there, because the Wi-Fi in the library is the one place locally they can get. And for them to kind of be sitting there, not being able to go to the bathroom, not being able to get a drink is different. Or they can see, or you can see in the background that, oh, guess what? Their parents are working and they have to watch their 3 younger siblings, and they're at university, and there's kids running around in the background, and someone else is, sitting by the pool in a nice calm environment. And so it begins to remove this facade that everyone's equal. So I think it's made that a real challenge to how do we rethink what does it mean to be to really provide an opportunity for everyone. So I think that those are the kind of the questions. I don't have answers or advice to give, but I think those are the kinds of questions that I hope that I know that the American universities are wrestling with, and I suspect that's probably true in other countries as well.
Yeah, one of the things that we did was, we sort of made it compulsory for all the faculty to make detailed lecture notes, and we made sure that we would provide hard copies of those lecture notes to students who couldn't afford to get online during this pandemic. So yeah, I agree with you that we have to find our own solutions given this sort of very, very difficult situation for people.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much for that. Would you have a parting message for my viewers, Dr. Steinman?
I guess there's 2 things. One thing I wanted to revisit about the question about the anti-Semitism and in general. One thing I always, and then one thing I'll kind of close on a message. The one thing that I think people, that people may not have a false impression of the Jewish community is that somehow we're in control of the media, the banks, the UN, and it is. And from our perspective, it becomes very almost comical when we see, oh, if only we had so much power to do this. So I remember hearing about how one meme about how the Jews had actually created the coronavirus, in order to acquire power. And guess what? I actually was infected, was one of the first people in my city to acquire COVID-19. And so I'm thinking, oh, like, I wish they could see me, and then they wouldn't, it would be, hopefully that would educate them a bit. So it becomes sort of comical to real. So I would try to encourage people to challenge this idea that somehow Jews are in control of the world. Because if we were, I think we'd do things much better or different, but we're not. So, and the other message I just wanted to say in closing that I really I thank you, and I really appreciate you being able to ask such insightful questions and give me a chance to hear myself think about some of these really big picture issues about our childhood and about our future, because it's not often we have a chance to kind of process this in a thoughtful way. And I'm sure that many of your viewers and your students are also wrestling with similar fundamental issues about how to be human, how to become kind, how to be our best possible selves in a really difficult time. So thank you for helping me, again, flesh out some of the questions, if not quite get to the answers.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Steinman, for taking the time from your very, very busy schedule. Hope to catch up with you sometime soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ajmal. Take care. Bye-bye.